quite a few married couples here today. Maybe some who are single or looking, maybe. There's a question that many of us have been asked. When I ask the question, try and think of the answer that you give. The question is, what are you looking for in a marriage mate? You can remember your answer. You might have said something like spiritual, funny, tall, short, thin, not so thin, short, patient, knows how to cook, etc., etc. But we all had an answer. I can almost guarantee none of us ever said perfect. I went to the dictionary and looked up this word, perfect. The verb form, it means completely free from faults or defects. Well, if you did get married and you thought your marriage mate was perfect, a surprise. We can't realistically expect perfection from someone imperfect. Isn't it true, though, that even though maybe you start to see certain things that maybe rub you the wrong way as you're married, something else happens. Love grows. It overshadows these little things that you might not like. You learn to see love and the more important things in your mate. Well, friends, if we can't have a perfect family at home, can we realistically think that we can have a perfect spiritual family? Because we are family. And, well, looking at the congregation, the spiritual family, most of us have made a vow or a promise recognizing that we need Jehovah in our lives. Well, part of that promise implies loving one another up to the point of even being willing to give our life for one another. Let's go to the book of John. I invite everybody to come with me to the book of John, chapter 13. John 13, verse 34. And this is Jesus Christ speaking. It says, I am giving you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love among yourselves. Well, we also learn that the Bible says that the Christ is the head of the congregation. If Christ is perfect, is the congregation perfect? Well, first, let's analyze why love, as Jesus said in the text we read, would identify his true disciples. Because how powerful is love, really? To see this, we're going to measure love in 1 Corinthians 13:13. So it's something that we all have to have. We have to see how powerful it is. 1 Corinthians 13:13. Now, however, these three things remain: faith, hope, love. But the greatest of these is love. How can that be? How can love possibly be more powerful than faith and hope? Well, we're going to see that in Romans chapter 13, and how important it is to each and every one of us as Christians. Romans chapter 13, 8 and 9. And again, you see how powerful love is. Now we're going to see how powerful it is and how it affects everything that we do. Romans 13, verse 8 and 9. Do not owe anything to anyone except to love one another. For whoever loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. For the law code, you must not commit adultery. You must not murder. You must not steal. You must not covet. You and whatever other commandment there is summed up in this saying. You must love your neighbor as yourself. Well, looking at verse 9, if you loved your mate, well, there would be no adultery. There would be no war, no murder, if through love things were resolved. Loving your neighbor would mean not taking or being jealous of what they had. Applying love in what we do, it protects us and it brings us closer together. Well, within the congregation of the first century, they were no different than us. They were imperfect. We're going to take a close look at the disciples. Let's go to John 17:6. And again, this is the Christ speaking. John 17:6. And this is Jesus praying. And he says, I have made your name manifest to the men whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have observed your word. Well, what Jesus is doing, he's talking about the 12. And God personally picked each and every one of them. So there was a quality about them that was very important. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is the disciples were raised in the Jewish religion. And in that culture, it was very stressed their position, their rank, who was important. Okay, so we're seeing two things. Jehovah picked them, and they were raised a certain way. Now let's go to Mark 9. Mark chapter 9. And we're going to go to verse 33. Mark 9:33. And they came to Capernaum. Now when he was inside the house, Jesus, he put the question to them, what were you arguing about on the road? Well, they kept silent. For on the road, they had been arguing among themselves about who was greater. Okay, so let's pause there. Let's now look at it from another angle. Let's go to Luke. It's the book next to Mark. Luke 9. Luke chapter 9, and we're going to go to verse 46. Luke 9:46. It says, then a dispute arose among them about which one of them was the greatest. Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a young child, stood him beside him, and said to them, whoever receives this young child on the basis of my name receives me also. And whoever receives me also receives the one who sent me. For the one who conducts himself as the lesser one among all of you is the one who is great. So we see two words. We see that there was a dispute. That's what the word is used in Luke. And we see there was an argument back in Mark. So remember, they were picked by Jehovah. Yet we see that they were imperfect. We're going to see two things. First, how did Jesus treat the disciples when he corrected them? Did you notice? Did he yell at them? Was he sarcastic? Did he call them names? No, he corrected them, but he lovingly did so. Secondly, did it say that the disciples were rebellious? No. They were humble enough to accept, obey, and continue in a good standing with Jehovah. One apostle, Peter, had a very good quality, or various qualities. The Bible also showed that he had to be corrected several times, boasting about how strong his faith was, but he denied Jesus 3 times. And in some occasions, he actually feared what people might think of him if they knew he was a Christian. They were imperfect. Here in the congregation, it could be that one brother may be offended by somebody. Maybe there's a miscommunication. Does this mean that there's no love here? Let's look at the example of Paul and Barnabas. We're going to go to the book of Acts, Acts 15. So as we're seeing, these were spiritual men, but they were imperfect, just like every one of us. Acts chapter 15, and we're going to start at verse 36. Acts 15, 36. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us now return and visit the brothers in every one of the cities where we proclaimed the word of Jehovah, to see how they are." Okay, so they're going to do some return visits here. Well, Barnabas was determined to take along John, who's called Mark. Paul, however, was not in favor of taking along with them, seeing that he had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. At this, there was a sharp burst of anger, so that they separated from one another. And Barnabas took Mark along and sailed away to Cyprus. Paul selected Silas and departed after he had been entrusted to the brothers to the underserved kindness of Jehovah. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the congregations. Did you notice here? It says there was a burst of anger. When I read that, I remember, it reminded me of bacon. When it burst, you don't want to be around it. So for these two spiritual men to get to this point, it was something that was quite serious. There was still love present because in both, Barnabas and Paul went on to continue their ministry. They didn't say, I quit. They continued. So now we have to analyze Barnabas and Paul once more, because Barnabas was known to be a warm-hearted and generous man. So much that that rather than call him by his given name, which was Joseph, the disciples surnamed him Barnabas, which means son of comfort. He had a good reputation. Paul, too, was known for his tenderness and gentle demeanor. He had a good reputation. Paul, for this reason, did not want Mark to come. This created a problem, as we saw. Now, what if you were with them and you were standing there during this burst of anger? Would that have affected you? Would that have made you say, well, they can't be spiritual men? Well, what can we see? Paul did bring Mark on another mission, on another trip. Paul practiced what he preached. The Bible doesn't say how they made up or doesn't give us that detail, but we see there was no animosity there. 1 Peter 4:8 says that love covers a multitude of sins, or in this case, we see that it was a disagreement. He was not bitter with Barnabas or with Mark, and that's something that we can truly learn from. Remember that definition of perfect? Completely free from faults and defects? Well, we see that none of the apostles or other congregations were perfect. But by exercising love through pure worship, they were able to overcome problems. At home, a Christian family is like a congregation. There's someone who takes the lead. There's a Bible study, but it's not perfect. There's disagreements. There might even be arguments. But as long as there is love, it will cover these problems like a blanket. If I had a fire and I were to cover that flame, what would happen to the fire? Paul went on to write several books of the Bible because God blessed him to do so, even though he wasn't perfect. Even though he made mistakes, Jehovah saw Paul's qualities. The way he treated others, the way he followed the word. He did not expect Paul to be perfect when he blessed him with these different trips, these different missions, or even to write the books in the Bible. Jehovah had a balanced view of Paul just as he has of us. He sent Jesus to die for imperfect people and not for perfect people. Well, because we are imperfect and we're surrounded by the world and its influence, we have to overcome the world's tendencies. One text that comes to mind is Ecclesiastes 7:21. Ecclesiastes 'I'm finding Ecclesiastes for some reason. Right? That may be problems. There it is. Right? Never fails, never fails. I lost it again. Thank you for being loving. Ecclesiastes 7:21. I did find it finally. And it says, also, do not take to heart every word that people say. Otherwise, you may hear your servant calling down evil upon you. For you will know in your heart that many times you yourself have called down evil on others. Well, we might offend someone without even knowing we have done so. Isn't that right? But why? How is that possible? Imperfection. Remember that definition of perfect? Completely free from faults or defects? Well, expecting perfection from ourselves or from others, that's not going to happen. But how we do use love as a blanket to cover ourselves or our faults, well, that will really help very much. 1 Corinthians 13:4 says, love is patient and kind. If there were a situation with someone, maybe someone said something a certain way and you took it the wrong way, or whatever the issue may be, wouldn't this help in solving that problem, that love among ourselves? In the world, a disagreement could even get you shot. Within families in the world, we see that families get split, or even worse, because love was not put into practice during problems. There was no patience. There was no kindness. There was no dignity. If you still have your Bibles with you, 1 Corinthians 13, and we're going to go to verse 5. First Corinthians chapter 13. We're going to go to verse 5, and it says, speaking on love, it does not behave indecently, does not look for its own interest, it does not become provoked, it does not keep an account of injury. Well, imagine this one text. All wars, all fights would end if this text was put into practice. One text. Verse 7, again, speaking about love, it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Whatever negative feelings we may have, love will help you get through it. But how do we know this? How can we be sure of it? Let's go to verse 8. The first 3 words there. Only 3 words, but they're powerful. Love never fails. What does this mean for Christians? Well, it means we have to use love to see the best in our brothers and sisters forever. Even if maybe at the moment it might be a little hard to do. Even if there is an issue. We are all here today because we know we are imperfect. Now, this applies to those who take the lead in the congregations, our older ones, our younger ones. We all have that obligation to apply love when we deal with one another. Well, it will make listening to Bible counsel a lot easier. It will make giving Bible counsel easier. It will make applying the Bible pleasing to our souls. We may feel offended or bothered. Maybe we may say or do something that offends by accident. But love is what will allow us to fix what needs to be fixed. Love is what the world does not have. Love is why we are different. Now, concluding text, we're going to go to 1 Peter. That's 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. 1 Peter 4, 8. It says, above all things, have intense love, because love covers a multitude of sins, or disagreements, or arguments, or whatever word you want to put there. True Christians are identified by this intense love. And isn't it true, it's not just locally, but it's globally. As the text said, let love be put above all, above any misunderstandings, any differences in personalities, maybe we clash a little bit, anything that could divide our congregation. If we have something with our brother or sister that we need to fix, don't wait till tomorrow, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. If you can do it today, do it today. Because like a fire, if you covered the flame, what would happen to the fire? So if we need to fix something with our brother or our sister, don't let that little flame go out of control. Now, do you remember that definition of perfect? Well, I know what is perfect. Love. It could be that it takes a big effort sometimes to put love in the front, to use it as a blanket to cover a situation or a feeling. Especially maybe if we're frustrated at the moment at someone. We don't condone or say that it's okay to be mistreated. But when things are resolved for love for one another, we'll look at the reward. If you can look at one another, you have a beautiful congregation. It doesn't just happen like that. It's because you let your brotherly love continue. There's work there because we're family. Some have overcome prejudice or stopped hatred for another culture or another race. Some have changed their lives, altering the way they maybe used to treat people. And others have learned to forgive. Isn't it refreshing when you come to Jehovah's house? It's warm, it's peaceful. Well, let us continue to be a witness to this world. Because by this, all will know that we are his disciples if we continue having love among ourselves.